If you think a simple morning walk is always safe, think again. Anita Rose was a mother of 6 and a grandmother of 13. Everyone in the small Suffolk village of Brantham knew her smile, her kindness, and her loyal Springer spaniel Bruce. On this day, she stepped out just after first light, taking the same path she'd walked countless times before. At 5:16 in the morning, she strolled down Rectory Lane, glancing at Bruce with the warmth only a dog owner knows. The air was calm, the street was empty, and nothing hinted at danger. But only minutes later, another figure entered the same stretch of road. Roy Barclay, 56 years old, living rough and moving like a shadow. Anita didn't see him. She couldn't have known that in less than an hour her life would be over. This was the last ordinary moment she would ever have. From the outside, Brantham looked like any other peaceful English village. Early risers were still making coffee, curtains were drawn, and the world was only just waking up. But out on that quiet path, two lives had just crossed, one full of love and routine, the other carrying something far darker. Roy Barclay wasn't just passing through. He had been drifting around Suffolk for months, living in makeshift camps, avoiding people, avoiding the law. Locals barely noticed him, and those who did thought he was just another man down on his luck. What no one knew was that he had a history of violent streak that didn't need a reason to surface. And now, by sheer chance, he was on the same path as Anita Rose. The clock was ticking. Every step they took was closing the distance between them, pulling Anita toward a moment she could never escape. In the grainy glow of a security camera, the story starts to tighten. Anita walks on, Bruce trotting at her side, her pace unhurried. Then, minutes later, another figure appears in the same shot. Roy Barclay. He doesn't rush. He doesn't call out. He moves like he belongs there, head down, eyes forward, blending into the empty street. But there's a weight in his body language, a stillness between steps that feels wrong. Barclay was no stranger to hiding in plain sight. For 2 years, he had been slipping between towns, sleeping rough, and keeping to the edges of society. This morning, those edges had bled into Anita's world. The camera doesn't capture a chase. There's no confrontation. Just two people on the same stretch of path, minutes apart, and one of them will never make it home. Somewhere on that familiar path, between the soft sound of Bruce's paws and the early morning birdsong, the quiet cracked open. It happened out of sight, away from cameras, in a place where no one could step in to help. A passing cyclist found Anita lying on the ground motionless, her face bloodied, her body twisted at unnatural angles. The attack had been savage. Later, medical experts would say her injuries were the kind you'd expect in a high-speed car crash. The blows to her head were so brutal that she never regained consciousness. Her phone was gone, her house keys missing, her pink jacket lying nearby. Whoever had done this had vanished before anyone could see his face. And there was Bruce, her loyal spaniel, pacing and whining, pawing at her as if sheer love could pull her back. In that single moment, what had started as an ordinary dog walk had turned into one of Suffolk's most chilling crime scenes. Anita was rushed to Addenbrooke's hospital, the sirens tearing through the early morning calm. For 4 days, her family clung to hope. They sat by her bed, holding her hand, talking to her, believing that somewhere inside she might still hear them. Machines beeped steadily, a cruel reminder that it was the only thing keeping her alive. But the damage was catastrophic. The head trauma, the internal injuries, all of it too severe to recover from. On the fourth day, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Anita slipped away. The news rippled through Brantham like a shockwave. People who had waved to her on that very route just days earlier were now laying flowers, staring at a cordoned off path, and asking the same question: why? Roy Barclay was 56 years old, but his life had been lived in shadows for years. He was a wanted man, a fugitive who had managed to stay hidden from police for more than 2 years. He slept in makeshift camps, some tucked under the hulking span of Orwell Bridge, others buried in the woodlands near Brantham. He scavenged what he needed to survive. No phone, no fixed address, no official records. He moved through the world like a ghost, careful to avoid CCTV, changing his appearance, staying just outside the reach of the law. Locals knew of a solitary man who sometimes appeared on the edges of footpaths or near the river, but few knew his name. To most, he was just another rough sleeper. To police, he was a dangerous man with a violent history. And to Anita Rose, on that July morning, he was a stranger whose path crossed hers and changed everything forever. The investigation began with nothing but a brutal crime scene and a village in shock. But detectives in Suffolk knew that random attacks leave traces somewhere, somehow. Officers combed the footpath and the surrounding fields, every blade of grass inspected, every possible escape route mapped out. Soon they started finding pieces of Anita's life scattered far from where she had fallen. Her pink jacket, her phone case, her back door key, all dumped in the woods in spots that suggested someone knew the terrain well. Forensic teams moved in, bagging each item carefully. The DNA tests came back with the name Roy Barclay. His profile had been on police systems from a previous violent offense. Suddenly, the shadowy figure from the CCTV wasn't just a mystery man. He was their suspect. And then came the breakthrough. Hidden camps deep in the trees, filled with scraps of clothing, food wrappers, and stolen items. Among them, Anita's belongings. It wasn't just proof he'd been there, it was proof he'd taken something from her after leaving her for dead. Now the hunt for Barclay was no longer a search for a stranger. It was a manhunt for a killer who had been hiding right under their noses. When the trial opened at Ipswich Crown Court, the man who had spent years avoiding the public eye was suddenly in full view. Roy Barclay walked in with the same detached expression he had worn throughout his arrest and interviews, no flicker of remorse, no visible reaction to the stares of Anita's family sitting only feet away. The prosecution laid out the chain of evidence piece by piece. CCTV showing Barclay in the same area as Anita on the morning of the attack. The recovery of her personal items in his woodland camps. Forensic evidence tying his DNA to her belongings. And then a damning detail his past. Years earlier, Barclay had violently attacked another woman, a crime disturbingly similar in its suddenness and brutality. That history painted a picture of a man who didn't need a motive to cause harm. Witnesses described the horror of finding Anita. Police officers testified about the painstaking searches through rough terrain to uncover his hideouts. The cyclist who discovered her spoke of a scene that would haunt him forever. Through it all, Barclay sat unmoved. After just 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of murder. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom, but for Anita's family, it wasn't the closure they had dreamed of because no verdict could bring her back. Judge Martin Levitt's words were sharp and deliberate. He called Barclay unpredictable and dangerous, noting that the attack had been both sudden and savage. There was no provocation, no reason, just a brutal assault that ended a life in minutes. The judge acknowledged that the silence from Barclay meant no one would ever truly understand what sparked the violence. The sentence: life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. In theory, it meant Barclay would not be free until he was in his 80s, if ever. But for Anita's family, that number felt hollow. Justice in the legal sense had been served, but the gap she left was immeasurable. Outside court, her children spoke to reporters. They described a mother who had been the anchor of a large, loving family, a woman whose days revolved around her grandchildren and the simple joy of walking her dog. They spoke of a future family gathering where her chair would always be empty and where every happy moment would carry a shadow. Today, Rectory Lane looks the same as it did on that July morning. The hedgerows are still neatly trimmed, the air still carries the scent of summer grass, and Bruce, now cared for by family, still knows the route by heart. But for those who loved Anita, it is no longer just a walking path. It is a place where the world changed forever. Locals still leave flowers there from time to time, small bursts of color against the green. Some pass by quickly, unable to look for long. Others stop and stand in silence, remembering the woman who always had a kind word for neighbors and strangers alike. And in that quiet, there's a question that refuses to fade. How can a moment so ordinary turn so suddenly into a nightmare? That's the truth about violence like this. It doesn't knock, it doesn't announce itself, and sometimes it comes from a person you never even saw coming. Anita Rose's last morning is a reminder that life's smallest routines can hold the biggest stories, and that some days you don't realize are your last until it's too late.